This episode is part of a series where I take already published memoir and break down what works about it and what doesn't work and why. I found that when I'm teaching my memoir method concepts to my writers, they benefit from seeing how these principles play out in memoir that you can find at the bookstore. This month, I'm looking at the memoir Renegade Agency by Andrea Verbanic, and today is part 2. If you want to catch up on this series with part 1, you can go back to episode 96. You are listening to the Memoir Method podcast, the place for writers, readers, and anyone who appreciates the collective power of our stories. In this podcast, we explore the impact of memoir alongside an examination of writing techniques and strategies used in the genre. Whether you are a writer looking for inspiration and guidance or a passionate reader seeking meaningful connections through shared experiences, the Memoir Method podcast is your go-to conversation spot. I'm your host, Charlotte, editor, writer, and the heart behind Charlotte Writes. Let's get started. As a reminder, before we get into this week's breakdown, if you haven't listened to part 1 of Why It Works or Not this month, the author of Renegade Agency is actually my very first memoir client. So this is a very full circle experience for me. I am coming into this analysis this month with a bit of a different angle from how I usually do with memoirs in this series. Last week, we talked about the foundation of her memoir. We talked about her focus, the angle that she's coming into her memoir with, the readers that she was keeping in mind, and the thesis that she was working with. And then today, I want to go into the structure behind her memoir. I want to pull out a few different elements that we considered and worked through in our work together to streamline and really tighten up her storytelling and her manuscript. When Andrea sent me her manuscript, she had everything written out chronologically. I see this often in manuscripts that my clients send me. And I say this with so much love for you. It is almost always a death knell. Going chronologically is not always a good way to create a compelling story. I want you to think about novels. And I talk about this with my writers in our one-on-one spaces and in my Memoir Method program. To become a better memoir writer, learn about fiction, study fiction. Going chronologically, more often than not, is going to really bog down your story. It's going to really slow it down and make it not fun for the reader. It's going to make for kind of a slog of a reading experience. With Andrea's memoir, we played around with her starting point. So while chronologically, the story started at a very specific point in time, the best way to bring the reader into the story was at a different point. So we played around with where we actually started off in chapter 1. Her opening scene. And then we threaded in the backstory as it was relevant for the reader. We used devices like cliffhangers strategically to create tension for the reader. We wanted the reader to keep leaning in, being like, wait, what's happening? Why is she making these choices? Why is she actually in this space? So instead of the pacing of this memoir dragging and slowing down everything at the beginning, we jumped into the story at a very dramatic point. And then once the reader was already hooked and invested, it made more sense to pull in the context in a way that they could follow, and more importantly, that the reader wanted to follow and understand. Eventually, we got caught up and we didn't need to pull in any more backstory and we could move forward. And by that point, the reader was not only informed, they were invested. They cared. There were clear stakes established in the first section of the book that the reader was on board with, and they really wanted to find out what happened. And from that point, the story carries itself. In Andrea's memoir, sticking to facts as much as possible was really important to her. And I'll go into this in a minute, but there is a difference between truth and fact. And as a creative nonfiction writer, you have more leeway than you sometimes think. For Andrea's memoir, however, it is in many ways procedural because she's working with different agencies and systems that have very specific procedures. And so she wanted to maintain her credibility as not only the writer, but also as an authority within the social workspace. So it was really important to her to pull from transcripts as much as possible, to keep dates as specific as possible, to stick to verifiable facts, because that in this specific story was really important for her credibility. Often with memoir, we can actually massage the nuts and bolts of an event or an experience in favor of amplifying and smoothing out the reading experience. There's many cases where I'll say, actually, like, what if we kind of played around with this, like changing where something happened or who you were talking to wouldn't change the truth of the experience. In some cases, like in Renegade Agency, those facts are really, really important. But in certain situations and stories like this one, the facts are most important, even when they're convoluted and hard to follow. So in those cases, my job as the editor was to communicate the facts and their implications as clearly as possible to make sure that the reader could track with all the moving pieces and kind of have their hand held as much as possible without being condescending. But it was really important for me as the editor to understand that Andrea needed to make sure all the facts were there. So if some of the dialogue was clunky, it was my job to keep it accurate because she was working off of transcripts. And so that was really, really important to her. And as a result, important to me as the editor, and to know this is the angle that we need to come at this from. That is one of my jobs as the editor, is to realize, okay, what is important to the writer and how do I amplify that? How do I bridge what's important to the writer with making a smooth reading experience for the reader? And then I want to talk about how we landed the plane, proverbially speaking, how we close out memoir. And that is another thing that I see a lot of writers come to me with, like, I don't really know how to close this. So just as we had to optimize the beginning of Andrea's memoir, we also had to make sure that we landed the plane well. And endings in memoir can be really tricky because memoir is not autobiography. It can be hard to wrap up the story in a clean way, especially if it might not have a tidy resolution. Like, how much in our lives have really tidy resolutions? Not much. Unlike fiction, plotting your own life can be really muddy because life is messy. So what could be a straightforward conclusion in a novel is going to be more meandering and unclear in a memoir, because sometimes there isn't the resolution that you'd expect in a work of fiction. Sometimes the resolution does drag on and on and on and on. So as Andrea and I were working together in Renegade Agency, we took kind of the really elongated conclusion and try to tighten it as much as possible. Also, again, sticking with the facts and keeping the thesis in mind. With Andrea's memoir in particular, we tightened the end to provide that smooth landing without keeping the reader taxiing on the tarmac, if you want to keep going with the airplane metaphor. You want to land the plane as smoothly as possible and get the passengers off the plane as efficiently as possible. In this case, we had to balance that with the tension of making sure that we were clear on the steps that happened after kind of the more climactic moments of her story. I loved working with Andrea and helping her bring her memoir to life. The work that I did with her really is the basis of everything that I do with clients now. Everything that I've taken every memoir through in this Why It Works or Not series, everything that I just broke down in these episodes about Renegade Agency, that is what I do with every memoir client. Like, obviously, this is what I did with Andrea before I even had the methodologies in place that I have now. If you want my eyes on your work, go ahead and either email me at hello@bookishedits.com, or you can book a free 30-minute call through the link in the show notes, and we'll figure out what is a good fit for you with where you're at in the writing and revisions process. If you want to read Andrea's memoir, Renegade Agency, and I promise you that you do, you can find that through the link in the show notes. Finally, join me next week as I have an in-depth conversation with Andrea about what it was like to self-publish her memoir and get it into the hands of readers she cares about the most. Her advocacy work is just beginning with her memoir. Her memoir is square one, and it is so exciting to see her take that and run with it. So I'm really excited for that episode next week. You will want to tune into that. Thank you so much for joining me today. I love having these conversations with you, and I will see you next time. You've just listened to an episode of the Memoir Method podcast. The Memoir Method podcast is presented by Charlotte Wrights. If you liked what you heard, the best way to support the show is to subscribe through your preferred podcast player. And if you're feeling especially inspired, I'd love it if you left a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. Leaving a review really does help other readers and writers like yourself find the show. If you want to continue the conversation, you can find me on my website at charlottewrites.co or on Instagram at charlottejanewrites. Thank you for tuning in. I'll see you next time. And remember that you have a story that matters.